Hello everyone, my name is Phil Agnew and you are listening to Nudge, a podcast dedicated to revealing the science behind marketing. Now, if you've listened to an episode of Nudge before, you will realise that it follows a similar theme. Typically, I present a cognitive bias. I share studies about it, and then I speak to marketers or researchers who have an understanding of who we are and how we make decisions and how we shift behaviour, essentially how we apply all that theory. I'd say the vast majorities of examples shared on this show talk about the successful application of nudges in the wild. And, well, we don't tend to focus on the failures. But that doesn't mean they don't happen. This field of work certainly isn't foolproof. I discovered this myself a few months back. I was trying to get people to stay subscribed to my email newsletter, specifically people who had signed up to my Science of Marketing course. So I sent this group of people an email and I tested in this email 2 subject lines. One subject line had social proof in it. It said that most Science of Marketing students sign up for weekly insights, are you in? And the other was just a normal control. I didn't think it would put much effort into it, so I just said, want to receive scientific marketing insights straight into your inbox, ? And that was the header. Now, there are hundreds of studies that tell me that the social proof version should work better, it should get a higher open rate, it should get fewer unsubscribes, but as I shared on an earlier episode, it didn't. The social proof version had a 46% open rate, whereas the control had a 71% open rate. Nudges, they don't always work. Studies in the lab don't always replicate in the field, and that's what today's guest is here on the show to talk about.
My name is Jason Collins, and I describe myself as a behavioral economist, although I'm probably many pieces. I used to be a lawyer, got bored of law, and because I realized I wanted to know what the law should be, changed myself to an economist, and then very quickly realized that economics was a fairly thin in some ways science itself, and that led me into behavioral economics. And I did a PhD, combining evolutionary biology and economics. That was my way of trying to get myself into a real understanding of what underlies economics. How do humans make decisions? And while I was doing that, I in some ways slipped into working in this space, consulting to companies, or basically around helping them think about how their customers make decisions, or for government, how citizens make decisions. And that's what I still do today. Today, I work largely around consumer financial decision making. So how can we help people make better decisions about their financial future?
Those financial companies that Jason works with need to make reliable decisions. A failure for them won't result in a few unsubscribers like me. No, for them it could result in millions of dollars lost. Jason, therefore, is rigorous in his application of behavioral economics and has strong views on how reliable it actually is.
I think there's several ways to think about the reliability of behavioral economics, and one of them is just around the reliability of the science itself. So, if you read a paper that comes out of the academic literature, how much can you trust it? And we know the answer to that for a lot of papers is not very much now, due to the what's known as the replication or reproducibility crisis, where many papers across basically the broader field of behavioral science, areas such as social psychology, simply haven't replicated when people have run the same study again. So that's sort of like in some ways problem number one. Happy to dig into that more. But problem number 2 for me is also around when you take a study and then you go to take it into a new context. And quite often this is taking a study from the lab out into the real world. And that is a much bigger leap than a lot of people realize. So when you find what seems to be a flaw in human judgment and in a quite artificial situation, and then say, look, I'm seeing this everywhere. That's why people are behaving this way in certain external circumstances. I think that's a really big call to make, and something that behavioral economists, behavioral scientists should be reluctant to make.
So I really wanted to know what we should look out for. What are some of the examples of nudges failing to replicate? And I guess importantly, are there common themes amongst these failures that we can spot, that we can look at and say, oh, that's something that doesn't replicate, or something I should look out for, or makes me distrust this piece of research? So here's Jason explaining what we should look out for.
Sure. So think about, I guess, the classic psychology study, and this is happening less now, but the way it used to occur is a psychology professor or the like would wheel in, say, somewhere between 30 and 100 undergraduate students, quite often closer to 30 than 100, put them into a room and get them to do some task that's designed to elicit an effect. And so, to give one classic story, which I'll use as a thread through this, research by John Barge and friends, where they got people in a room and they had them solve word puzzles. And some of the people had word puzzles which included words relating to old people, such as grey or Florida, that kind of thing. And unbeknownst to the participants, the purpose of that exercise wasn't for them to, I guess, the word puzzles itself. It was that they timed their walking speed as they left that exercise, walking down a hall. And the initial finding from that study was that people walked slower if they'd been primed with these ideas around old people. So, seeing the word Florida or grey or other words such as that in these word puzzles. And so that sort of, little cutesy kind of setup is really common across psychology experiments. A task with a small number of people, quite typically a very small slice of the population. Now, the idea behind the replication crisis is that, if this is really a substantial finding, like something that's robust, you should then be able to take another group of people and put them through the same experiment and find the same result. And so the heart of the replication crisis is basically that when people started to take these studies, effectively run them again, and quite often with larger numbers of people, because you need a large number of people to detect small effect sizes, which is probably what you'd expect from a lot of these studies. And what they found when they run these studies again, so many of them, there's simply no effect there. So that study of the people walking slowly, which is, the effect became a classic known as the Florida effect. And so a lot of the early behavioral economics texts would talk about that. So I think thinking fast and slow among them. And basically, there's just in the end, there was just nothing there. And this happened again and again and again. So there was one large study published in Science by Brian Nozick and friends, where they did looked at about, I think it was 100 exactly, 100 psychology studies. And the replication rate was, I don't remember the exact number, it was 30-something%. So 30-something% of the studies, when they ran it again, they found that the result actually held. And this isn't just limited to psychology. So economics has a similar problem, perhaps not as serious. In fact, a lot of medical research even has been found to have a bit of a replication crisis. So in the psychology space, what was interesting is, in some ways, the differences between the studies that were robust and not. And so the studies that really probably were the least robust were an area called social psychology, where these studies such as priming, so around external factors, how do they affect your behavior? The priming literature is just now the poster child for failed replications. This idea you can plant a subtle idea in someone's mind, and then that will have a major change in their behavior. And I suppose as perhaps a lot of this audience for this podcast being marketers, it's quite interesting, because I think a lot of marketing in some ways relies on that idea of priming to try and get people to effectively take an action, and how much of that is, I think the question, how much of that is going to be actually a robust effect.
There are a few really important themes that we should all look out for when judging how reliable a study is. The first thing that Jason mentioned is that small sample size. This is probably the biggest red flag. If a study only has a couple of dozen people involved, that's something to look out for. The next is only researching a small slice of the population, usually just one demographic. Now this gets me thinking back to that social proof failure I shared at the start. Now, I class that as a failure, but on reflection, I don't think I had the sample size that I even needed to make that judgment. The email only went out to a few hundred people, and they're obviously not the most diverse group of people, with most being English-speaking marketers. These are the warning signs that we should all look out for when assessing the reliability of behavioural science. Now, priming is a nudge that seems especially shaky. We've spoken about this before on the show. And it's not a surprise, right? The idea that really subtle external factors can have such a dramatic impact on our behaviour just seems fanciful. And that's because it is. Here's Jason with another example.
So the other examples out there, which I think are quite interesting, such as the idea that you put dollar bills around and it leads to people exhibiting more greedy behaviour, like having the dollar sign around. giving people, getting people to read an honor code before they do a test. Similar sort of thing where that, initial studies say great to reduce cheating, sort of replications to show there's no effect there. So pretty long tail of failures and not a lot of great, robust replications that you could point to say, okay, here's a particular effect that I'd be confident about.
But it's not just priming. There are plenty of other examples of biases that appear prevalent inside the lab that simply can't be replicated in the real world. One of the most illuminating examples comes from NBA and the hot hand theory.
So let me tell a little bit of, I suppose, a story about one particular study, which I think is just wonderfully illustrative, and I use this in the Nudge Stock talk. So one quite robust finding in the lab is that people tend not to have a great sense of what randomness looks like. So if you ask them to write a sequence of coin flips and to basically mimic randomness when they write out that sequence, they'll actually alternate far too often. They won't have enough streaks of, say, heads and tails. So really robust lab finding, that one. But then you go, well, what happens when we start, look in the outside world, start looking at what happens when people are seeing, streaks in real life? What do they think? And so in sports, we've got the idea of the hot hand. And that's the idea that when someone shooting a basketball, could be, kicking goals, it's like whatever it might be, that we describe people as being hot. And the question is, are they really, really hot? So if someone, when they're shooting a basketball, is this really just a random sequence? They've got the same probability of every shot? Or if over time, do they hit one and then are they more likely to hit further shots? And so as far as athletes are concerned and most people watching sports are concerned, they'll say, that there's a hot hand here. They'll believe this isn't a random pattern they're seeing. This is actually something quite streaky. So three quite well-known behavioral economist psychologists, Thomas Gilovich, Robert Vallone, and Amos Tversky, they went to have a look at this and they got shot data from a couple of NBA basketball teams. And they looked at it and said, is there a hot hand in this data? And so when someone had made a shot, are they more likely to hit subsequent shots? And the result of their examination was they basically said, no, there's nothing there. There is no such thing as a hot hand. This was another example of the phenomena that they'd seen in the lab. People had a really poor sense of what randomness looks like, and they were seeing streaks and patterns where it was actually just a random pattern. And this result, when it came out, was just, I guess, people just didn't believe it. So there's plenty of great quotes from various basketball coaches and the likes, where they said, I'm not going to take this on board. I know a hot hand when I see one, basically. And so part of the story almost became around, not just around how people see a hot hand when one doesn't exist. It also became a story of how once they were shown the truth, they were unable to accept it. And that was the case for about 30 odd years. And then this is what the real twist in this story is. Joshua Miller and Adam Sanherho basically went back and looked at the initial studies. So this initial study by Gilovich, Vallone, and Tversky, and realized they'd sort of made a subtle error in their analysis. And it's really quite tricky as to how, trying to explain this particular error. But there was basically a bias in the way they examined that data. And so when you actually examined it, correctly, they found that there actually was a hot hand. And this was such a strong hot hand that the different, to give one example where they were describing the magnitude, someone who had got three previous shots in basketball in the NBA in this particular data set, they would be 13 percentage points more likely to get the next shot in than if they'd had three previous misses. So really strong hot hand. That's sort of difference is between the average shooter in the NBA and the very best. So quite substantial. So it's kind of this funny story where, initially they think, look, you humans are foolish. Look, we've seen in the lab. Now we've come out and found it in real life. You don't believe us. And then really, fought against the fans. But as it turned out, the average fan in the stands, the coaches in the basketball, the players, they were actually the ones with the better sense of what was happening than the academics.
It's a great example from Jason. And it got me wondering, are there any nudges or biases that we're using today that we're certain are working right now and appear to be getting results that will only be proven to be non-existent in 30 years? I asked Jason.
I think there's probably not too many. We'll have to wait 30 years. So to be fair to Gilovich, Vallone, and Tversky, the error that they made was quite subtle. I think a lot of the the work now that's going to, I guess, fall apart. It's going to fall apart on a smaller time scale. And you mentioned earlier that piece of work around the idea that placing a signature at the beginning of, say, the initial research was around insurance claim forms, but it's been applied all sorts of places, such as terms and conditions. But this idea where that can prime honest behaviour, where people will then be more likely to give an honest answer at the when they're answering subsequent questions, and that I think it was less than 10 years there for something to basically a result, very famous, sexy result with a lot of actual what seemed to be practical application. But what happened there is quite quickly people went out and tried it, and it just didn't work. And so it was quite, it was only a few years after sort of the initial result that people were there sort of looking at their results going, why isn't this panning out? And then a group of academics sort of went to the original authors, and together they both looked at the original data and said, hang on, maybe it wasn't quite as well analyzed as we thought, but also generated some new data and said, okay, that there's actually nothing here. I think that's the sort of cycle that at least that I hope we'll have for a lot more of this research, is quite rapid testing of them.
If, like me, you're keen to test out behaviour science in your work, then make sure you're running tests that allow you to really assess the performance of the nudges you're using. I've ranted on this show about the power of social proof, but that doesn't mean I use it blindly. I always make sure to run A/B tests to at least attempt to assess the effectiveness of the bias I'm testing out. But say we hear about a brand new bias. Should we get started right away and test that out on our audience, or should we wait for the professionals to replicate the studies first?
In that case, it's a real, I guess, cost-benefit analysis there. So think about a Google who have, I guess, I'd be pretty some astounding number of eyeballs every day, and they could probably run tests very quickly, cheaply, and all of those tests are they're around whether someone clicks on an ad or not, or what they do on a search engine, or how they interact with their Android phone, whatever it may be. But they're fairly, I guess, innocuous results a lot of the time. So when we can run something quickly, the potential harm is low, the cost is low. Like that's to the extent you can be running a real production line of experiments there. That's great. And in fact, the way you think of it is people can come up with even just random ideas, not even out of academic papers. And that's what happens, I suppose, in a lot of marketing, and in fact, just A/B testing coming out of customer experience labs. They just go, oh, this will be an interesting idea. Let's give it a crack, and that's great. But then you've got a lot of other ideas where it's simply not as easy a task to actually go out and test it. And so going back to that story of the signing at the top of the form. So, that sort of thing, there's probably some scenarios where it's easy to do, but like a lot of the scenarios where it was tested, organizations had to go through and redesign forms or digital processes, actually quite expensive experiments, and a lot of resources were wasted there. So I think there's probably some sort of filter that just needs to be applied to going, ultimately, can we test this efficiently, quickly, or not?
This is great advice for marketers. If you can, run a quick test where the sample size is large and the resource isn't too great. And that's what I've done with social proof. You can go back and listen to the Nudge experiment episode on social proof, where I talk about the Reddit ad that I put out, which tested a social proof version of that ad side by side with a control. The only thing changed was the image to really nail in and make sure that we were testing social proof. And I was able to get some results that quite clearly showed me that the social proof version had a higher click-through rate and a higher effectiveness. And that was only by spending about $108, but actually reaching an audience of 200,000 people, so you could get quite conclusive results. But as Jason says, don't just take this as gospel, go and test it out for yourself. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. It was great fun chatting with Jason. He's a brilliant behavioural and data scientist with a much needed critical look at the world of behaviour science. If you want to keep up to speed with Jason, you can do so by checking out his blog. That's jasoncollins.blog, Jason Collins being all one word. And I've left a link to that in the show notes, so you can click on that to check it out. I've really enjoyed putting this episode together, in particular sharing some of the small tests I've run myself. And if you've enjoyed hearing about that, then please do go back and listen to that 4-episode mini-series that I did recently, which really talked through some of the tests that I've been running to test the validity of nudges. You can email me if you've got any feedback about the show. I'm phil@nudgepodcast.com, or you can reach out to me on Twitter @P_Agnew there. I'm also on LinkedIn @PhilAgnew. I'd love to hear from you and love to get some feedback. I'll be back in 2 weeks for another episode of Nudge, and make sure you sign up to the emailing list to make sure you don't miss that. Simply click the link in the show notes to sign up. And that is all we've got time for today. So cheers again, and thank you for listening to this episode of Nudge.